Some questions are never meant to leave your mouth. They live in the body, in the marrow, in the low hum beneath your sleep. And when something out past the horizon answers one of those questions, something bolted to the ocean floor that has no ears, no mind, no right to know you. The horror is not that it spoke. The horror is that it was correct. The masks have gathered and a seat has been left open. If you have found your way here before, you know what is asked. Rest your hand upon the dark. Leave your signal at the threshold. Set the frequency so the next transmission finds you without delay. And if the water has ever spoken to you in a voice you nearly recognized, confess it below before the tide returns. The story is beginning. I need to be careful about how I tell this, not because I think someone will come after me. Nobody cares enough to come after me. The contract expired, the office closed. The equipment was auctioned off in a single lot alongside water-damaged filing cabinets and a broken marine VHF set that someone from Coos Bay bought for $40. There is nothing left of the Faircross Coastal Monitoring Program except a few crates of water-stained logbooks sitting in an Oregon State Archives annex that nobody has requested access to in at least 3 years. I know this because I check. I check every few months. I am the only person who has ever requested those files since they were deposited, and the archivist who processed my last request looked at me with the particular flat patience of someone who has learned not to ask why a man drives 4 hours to read his own handwriting. So no, I am not afraid of being silenced. I am afraid of being precise. I am afraid that if I describe exactly what happened during the 14 months I spent monitoring offshore the transmission buoys for a regional coastal data cooperative, I will have to be honest about the part that concerns me. Not the dead buoy, not the signal, not the pattern it sent, the question it answered. Because I never transmitted that question. I never wrote it down. I never said it out loud to anyone, not once, not in any form. And I need someone to explain to me how a decommissioned NOAA weather buoy, unmoored and drifting 31 nautical miles off the southern Oregon coast with no battery, no solar array, and no functioning transmitter knew the one thing about my life that I had never told another living person. My name is not important. Call me what you want. I was 34 when I took the job, and I am 37 now. And in those 3 years, I have become someone I do not fully recognize. Not because anything dramatic happened to my face or my body, but because I make decisions differently. I pause at strange moments. I stop mid-sentence for reasons I cannot explain to anyone, least of all myself. I have developed the habit of listening to things that are not speaking. I will stand still in the middle of a room with my head slightly turned, waiting for a sound that does not come and that I am not sure I want to come. I cannot tell whether that habit is damage or whether it is the only accurate instinct I have ever developed. I think about that distinction often, more often than I should. The job was simple to describe and strange to perform. The Faircross Coastal Monitoring Program was a cooperative. Not federal, not state, not military, not academic. It was funded by a patchwork of small municipal grants from coastal towns between Brookings and Florence, Oregon, supplemented by a modest NOAA data sharing agreement that gave us access to certain decommissioned equipment in exchange for maintaining a continuous data log of sea surface temperature, wave height, barometric pressure, and current drift along a shipping corridor that the National Weather Service had quietly deprioritized in 2014 when their budget shifted towards satellite coverage. The towns still needed the data: fishing advisories, harbor management, erosion tracking, the kind of low-grade coastal planning that nobody notices until a winter storm takes out a seawall and everyone asks why no one was watching. I was the watcher. Or more precisely, I was one of 2 watchers, though by the time things went wrong, I was functionally the only one. My colleague Dina had reduced her hours to 12 a week due to a medical issue she never specified, and I never asked because that was the culture of the office. Small staff, limited funding, salt-warped walls. You did not ask. You logged. The office was a rented room above a marine supply store in a town I will call Faircross because that is the name we used in all our internal documentation and because the actual town does not need to appear in this story. It was a small building, low ceilings, the particular smell that every Pacific Northwest coastal structure acquires after 30 years of proximity to the sea. Salt, mildew, diesel, pine resin, and underneath it all, the faint persistent sweetness of rotting kelp that never fully leaves your sinuses, no matter how many times you wash your hands or change your shirt. We had 3 desks pushed against 3 walls, 2 computers that ran custom telemetry software on an operating system old enough to vote, a whiteboard with a Buoy grid map I had drawn myself in blue and red dry erase marker, and a receiving station that pulled data from 11 active buoys and 2 decommissioned units that we were technically not responsible for, but whose signals we received anyway. Nobody had told the buoys to stop transmitting. Nobody had told us to stop listening. This is important. The 2 decommissioned buoys were not under our management. We did not maintain them. We did not visit them. We did not include their data in our municipal reports or our NOAA submissions. But their signals arrived on the same frequency band as our active units, and our receiving software logged them automatically into a separate partition that I thought of as the dead shelf, a column of numbers that nobody analyzed and nobody deleted. Dina had mentioned once early in my training that one of the decommissioned units occasionally produced readings that correlated interestingly with storm patterns about 3 days before our active buoys registered the same front. She said it casually, the way you mention an old clock that still keeps time even though no one winds it. And because of that one comment, I developed the habit of glancing at their feeds when I opened the log each morning. Just a glance, a half-second of attention before moving on to the real work. That was the full extent of my relationship with Buoy 7 Victor, registry designation NDB7V, when I started. A glance, a number on a screen that I did not report, did not analyze, did not think about for more than the time it took to confirm it was still producing its usual flat line of zeros. For 11 months, 7 Victor's feed was exactly that. A flat line interrupted occasionally by a short burst of what our software categorized as transmission noise. A brief spike the system flagged as TN. I had learned to ignore it the way you learn to ignore the sound of a refrigerator cycling on in the next room. It was nothing. It meant nothing. It was the electronic equivalent of a dead man's fingers twitching in the cold. I need to describe my days so you understand the rhythm I was living inside before the rhythm broke. I arrived at the office at 6:30 each morning. The marine supply store below us did not open until 7, and for those first 30 minutes, I was alone in the building. Just me and the gulls walking the roof overhead, and the occasional car hissing past on the wet coast road outside. I would hang my jacket on the hook by the door, the same hook every morning, second from the left, and start the electric kettle that Dina had left on top of the filing cabinet. While the water heated, I would stand at the window for a moment and look out at the marina parking lot and the gray strip of ocean beyond the breakwater. Some mornings the fog was so thick I could not see the water at all, only hear it. The low, constant percussion of the surf against the rocks beneath the seawall. On those mornings, the world felt very small. Just the office and the fog and the sound of the kettle building toward its click. Then I would turn on the receiving station and listen to it hum through its startup sequence. I found that sound comforting in a way I never told anyone. It was mechanical and predictable, and it meant the day had a shape. I checked each active buoy's overnight feed in order, north to south. I noted any anomalies, a sensor dropout, a GPS drift, a wave height spike that might indicate a ship wake rather than weather. I entered my summary into a shared spreadsheet that Dina would review later in the week. On Mondays, I compiled the previous week's data into a short report that went to the municipal contacts in 4 towns. On Thursdays, I compared our readings against the NOAA open access feed to check for calibration drift. On the first of each month, I ran a diagnostic request on each active buoy, essentially a ping that asked the unit to confirm its battery level, solar charge status, and sensor array integrity. The buoys always answered. They were reliable machines doing reliable work, and I found a deep and genuine comfort in their consistency. I should say this honestly because it matters for what comes later. I loved that job. I know that sounds strange for a position that involved sitting alone in a damp room staring at numbers for 8 hours a day, but I need you to understand what I had come from. I arrived in Faircross from a situation I will not describe in full detail except to say that my previous life involved a great deal of noise. Human noise, emotional noise, the noise of a marriage that had ended in a way that left me unsure of my own memory, unsure which version of events was real and which I had constructed to survive the telling. I spent 2 years in Portland after the separation doing contract data work that paid well enough but took place in open-plan offices full of people who talked constantly about nothing. By the time I saw the Faircross posting on a state employment board, I was the kind of person who ate lunch alone in his car with the engine off and the windows up just to hear nothing for 45 minutes. The silence of the coast was not isolation to me. It was medicine. The ocean did not ask me questions. The buoys did not need me to explain myself. The data came in, and I recorded it. And at the end of the day, I drove back to my rented cottage in the Shore Pines and cooked something simple, rice, vegetables, whatever was in the cabinet, and fell asleep to the sound of the waves through the open kitchen window. For the first time in years, I was not dreading the morning. I want to be clear about that. I was healing, slowly, unevenly, in the way that actual healing happens. Not a smooth upward line, but a messy process of feeling slightly less terrible each month, and occasionally noticing that you have gone an entire afternoon without thinking about the thing that broke you. I was healing, and the job was the architecture of that healing, and the quiet was its foundation. That is why what happened was so efficient in its cruelty. It used the exact thing that was saving me as the mechanism for undoing me. But I am getting ahead of the record. 11 months into my tenure, on a Wednesday in early February, I arrived at the office at my usual time. The morning was overcast and still, the kind of Oregon coast morning where the sky and the ocean are the same shade of gray and the horizon disappears and you feel as though you are sitting inside a closed eye. I hung my jacket, started the kettle, powered the station and listened to its familiar clicks, sat down, opened the telemetry log, scanned the active buoys, everything nominal, nothing unusual, the ocean behaving itself. Then I glanced at the dead shelf. 7 Victor had generated a transmission flag that was not coded as TN. The software had classified it as DT, data transmission, not noise, data. This had never happened before in my time at Faircross. I scrolled back through the archive to check Dina's tenure, which extended 3 years before mine. No DT flags from 7 Victor. Not one. The buoy had been decommissioned in 2016 following a failed retrieval attempt. Its mooring chain snapped in a November storm, and the unit was declared adrift. NOAA logged its last confirmed position at approximately 31 nautical miles west-southwest of Faircross, and closed its file with the standard notation, Unit non-recoverable. Transmission capability nil. Removed from active monitoring upon signal cessation. The signal had not ceased. It had just been empty. Years of zeros and noise bursts that our software dutifully recorded and nobody read. And now, on this gray Wednesday morning, it had sent data. I opened the packet. It was small. 340 bytes, which is almost nothing. A standard transmission from one of our active units ran about 2 kilobytes and included sea surface temperature, wave height, wave period, barometric pressure, wind speed and direction, current speed and direction, and a GPS position fix. The 7 Victor packet contained none of those fields. What it contained when I ran it through our decoding template was a single line of text in the operator message field. This was a field designed for maintenance technicians to embed short service notes during calibration visits. It required manual input through a hardware interface physically connected to the buoy's onboard computer. It was not a field a buoy could populate on its own, not remotely, not under any conditions. The message read, Bridge Road, 4 p.m. I stared at it for a long time. The kettle clicked off behind me, and I did not get up. The steam rose in a thin line and vanished against the low ceiling. I read the words again. Then I closed the log. Then I opened it again to make sure I had not misread. I had not. I printed the page, a habit I had developed for anomalies worth discussing with Dina, and set the printout on her desk with a sticky note that said, 7V did something weird worth a look, and I forced myself to go on with the morning. Here is what I did not think about, and what I should have thought about, and what I have spent every day since turning over in my mind like a stone I cannot put down. Bridge Road was the name of the road I took home. It was not a major road. It was not on any nautical chart or coastal survey or municipal planning document that crossed my desk. It was a residential road, narrow and unlined, that connected the coast highway to a small cluster of rental properties set back in the shore pines. I drove it twice a day, once in and once out, and I had never mentioned it in any log, any email, any report, any conversation with Dina or anyone else. It was part of my private life. It belonged to the portion of my existence that had nothing to do with the ocean or the data or the work. At 4 that afternoon, I was on Bridge Road. I was always on Bridge Road at 4. That was when I left the office. And on that particular afternoon, approximately 200 yards from my cottage, a deer stepped out of the pines and stood in the middle of the road. I braked hard and sat there with my heart loud in my ears while the engine idled. The deer stared at me through the windshield with the total unreadable calm of an animal that has no concept of what a car is and therefore cannot fear it. Its eyes were dark and wet, its ears turned slightly, independently, like small satellite dishes reading the air. It looked at me for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 10 seconds. Then it turned and walked into the trees on the other side without urgency, without sound, and I drove the last 200 yards to my cottage and made dinner, and did not think about the buoy's message again until the next morning. Because the next morning, 7 Victor had transmitted again. Same packet size, same field, same impossible self-populated operator message. Kitchen window, tonight, leave it closed. I read it 3 times. I stood up from my desk without deciding to stand and walked to the window and looked out at the marina parking lot, where a man in rubber boots was hosing down a cooler, and everything was ordinary. The morning light was thin and gray, and the parking lot was wet, and the ordinariness of it all felt fragile, like a sheet of ice you can see through to the dark water beneath. I had left my kitchen window open the previous night. I always left it open. The cottage was poorly ventilated, and the kitchen held cooking smells, and the night air off the ocean was cold and clean, and I slept better when I could hear the waves. But I had not told anyone this. I lived alone. I had no visitors. No one had been inside my cottage except me since the day I moved in. No one on earth knew my kitchen window habits. I closed the window that night. I stood in the kitchen with my hand on the latch, and I could not articulate what I thought would happen if I left it open. I had no image, no scenario, no specific fear. Just a subsidence in my chest, a settling, like a layer of earth dropping 1 inch lower than it should. I closed the window and went to bed and lay there listening to the silence that the glass made of the ocean. Not the absence of sound, but the muffling of it. The waves reduced to a murmur so distant it could have been my own blood, and I understood for the first time that I was afraid. Dina came in the next day. She had seen my printout. She picked it up from her desk and brought it to mine and set it down in front of me and said, "Transmission noise." The decoder mapped garbage data onto the text field. Happens with degraded units. Her voice was steady and practical, and I wanted very badly to believe her. I asked if it had happened before with 7 Victor specifically. She said no, but that the unit's transmitter was severely degraded, and that random bit patterns could theoretically resolve into SI characters given enough time and enough transmissions. I asked her what the statistical odds were of random bit patterns resolving into coherent English words forming a grammatically correct sentence that referenced a specific road by name. She looked at me with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone who has decided that a question is really about something else and has chosen not to engage with the something else. She said, "Log it as TN and move on. That buoy is dead." I logged it as TN. I did not move on. The following Wednesday, a full week after the first message, I opened the morning log to find a third transmission. Same format, same impossible field. The call will come Thursday. Do not pick up. I stared at it and felt nothing except a very calm, very clear alertness. The kind of clarity that arrives in the first seconds after a car accident before the shaking starts. Thursday came. I was at the office. My phone, which I kept face down on my desk out of habit, vibrated at 11:14 in the morning. I turned it over. The screen showed a number I had not seen in over a year, but recognized immediately because some numbers live in your body the way some names do. It was my ex-wife. She had not called since the separation. There had been no reason for contact. The lawyers handled everything, yet here was her name on my screen, arriving on the exact day the dead Buoy had predicted. I sat in my chair and watched the phone vibrate on the desk for 6 rings, and I did not pick up. She did not leave a message. I spent the rest of that day unable to concentrate. I checked the active buoys mechanically, entered data mechanically, filed the weekly report. But my hands felt disconnected from my thoughts. Every few minutes I would look at the phone and think about calling her back, and then I would think about the buoy, and the two thoughts would collide inside me and produce a silence I did not know how to fill. The fourth transmission arrived the following Monday. Pipeline Road closed Friday. Check before you leave. I drove Pipeline Road every Friday for groceries in the next town north, a narrow 2-lane road through dense coastal forest. No shoulders, no cell service for a 3-mile stretch. That Friday before leaving, I checked the road conditions on the state transportation website, something I had never done before. A notice posted 90 minutes earlier. A Douglas fir had fallen across both lanes overnight. Estimated clearing time 4 to 6 hours. If I had driven out without checking, I would have been stuck for half a day in a dead zone with no phone signal and no way to turn around. I sat in the office reading the closure notice, and I thought very clearly, I am taking instructions from a machine that has been dead for years. I am obeying it, and it has been right every single time. The fifth transmission came on a Tuesday in early March. Dina will not come back after March. I read it and set the printout on the stack and went about my work and tried not to think about it. 2 weeks later, Dina called the office. She was resigning. The medical issue. Moving to Sacramento. Her sister. Her voice had the careful steadiness of someone delivering a line they rehearsed in the car on the way to the phone. I told her I understood. I wished her well. I hung up and sat in the office alone and listened to the receiving station click through its cycles and understood that I was now the only person monitoring the feed. The only person who would see what 7 Victor sent next. The only person left who could tell me it was noise, and there was no one. The 6th arrived 2 days after Dina left. The pain in your right shoulder is not injury. It will pass by Sunday. I had woken that morning with a sharp ache in my right shoulder, the kind you get from sleeping with your arm bent at an odd angle. It worried me. My father had a rotator cuff tear at my age, and I had been quietly waiting for my body to start failing in the ways his had. The pain passed on Sunday, completely, as if it had never been there at all. The 7th said, "Your neighbor's dog will come to your porch Wednesday. His name is Cal. Let him stay." On Wednesday evening, as the sun was dropping low over the pines and the air was turning cool and sharp with the smell of salt and damp earth, a yellow Labrador appeared on my porch. He padded up the steps and sat down near the door and looked at me through the screen with the patient expectation of a dog who has been invited. I had never seen this animal before. I did not know my nearest neighbor owned a dog. I brought out a bowl of water and sat on the porch steps, and the dog leaned against my leg with the full warm weight of his body. I put my hand on his broad head and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. The simple comfort of being near another living creature that expected nothing from me except my presence. We sat there together while the light faded and the ocean turned copper and the pines went dark against the sky, and somewhere out on the water, the buoys were sending their signals into the dusk like steady pulses of a heart that does not sleep. The neighbor came looking for him an hour later. His name was Harlan. The dog's name was Cal. Harlan apologized and I told him it was no trouble and meant it. He took the dog home. I went inside and closed the door and stood in the kitchen and looked at the folder on the table, and I understood that whatever was speaking through that buoy did not just know my schedule and my geography. It knew my loneliness. It knew the shape of the whole. Each transmission landed with the same weight, not dramatic, not theatrical, factual, accurate, mundane in subject matter, and extraordinary in impossibility. And with each one I felt the floor of my understanding settle another inch lower, until I was standing in a room whose dimensions had not changed, but whose foundation was somewhere I could no longer see. I stopped logging them as TN. I stopped logging them at all. I began printing each one and adding it to a folder at home. A plain manila folder that I placed on the kitchen table where I could see it morning and evening. I had developed a ritual I am not proud of. Each morning, I arrived at the office, opened the telemetry log, and checked 7 Victor's feed before anything else. Before the active buoys, before the weather, before my email. I would sit in the gray light of 6:30 and read whatever the dead buoy had sent me overnight and feel a sensation I can only describe as the opposite of loneliness. A terrible, unwanted intimacy with something I could not see, could not locate, and could not refuse. And then, in late April, the transmissions changed. Not their format, not their source. Their content shifted. Like a conversation that has been circling politely around the room and finally sits down next to you. The first 14 had been practical, predictions, instructions, small warnings about events in my immediate future. They had the texture of advice. They were helpful, in the way a stranger's hand on your shoulder is helpful right up until you realize you never felt it arrive. The 15th transmission said, "You have not asked about Eleanor." I was holding a cup of tea when I read it. The cup was warm in my hands and the office was quiet. And outside the window, a gull was standing on the railing of the marina parking lot with its head turned sideways, watching nothing. Everything was ordinary. And the name on the screen was my mother's name, Eleanor. She died when I was 19. A stroke, sudden and total, at 51 years old. I had not spoken her name aloud in years. I had trained myself away from it in the way you train yourself away from any wound that will not heal. You do not touch it. You do not reference it. You walk a careful perimeter around it, and eventually the perimeter becomes so natural that you forget the wound is there, which is exactly what the wound wants. Because a wound that is forgotten is a wound that is permanent. I set the cup down on the desk. The tea went cold. I sat in the office and stared at the screen and felt something open in my chest that I had spent 15 years sealing shut. The opening was not gentle. It was the feeling of a door being pushed from the other side by something patient and strong. The buoy knew her name. The buoy knew my perimeter. It was standing inside the careful circle I had drawn around the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And it was looking at me with the patience of something that has no schedule, no needs, no reason to hurry. I did not respond. I need to stress that. I had no means of responding. 7 Victor was a receive-only feed in our system. We had no transmitting capability to decommissioned units, no reply function, no input mechanism, no two-way channel of any kind. The buoy spoke and I listened, and that was the total architecture of our connection. And the fact that I just used the word connection tells you everything about the state I was in. The 16th transmission arrived the next morning. I drove to the office faster than usual. I caught myself doing it leaning forward over the steering wheel on the coast road, hurrying toward a screen the way you hurry toward a letter you have been waiting for. I noticed what I was doing, and the noticing did not slow me down. It said, "She did not blame you. You know that. But you have not let yourself know it." I left the office, walked down the exterior stairs, and stood in the gravel lot next to the marine supply store and breathed the salt air and watched the ocean, flat, gray, enormous, utterly indifferent to the fact that somewhere out in its body a dead machine was performing surgery on a living man's grief with a precision no therapist, no friend, no minister had ever achieved. I stood there for 20 minutes. A woman came out of the supply store carrying a bag of dock line, nodded at me, walked to her truck, and drove away. I was alone again in the way I had chosen to be alone, except now the aloneness had a crack in it, and something was coming through. I went back inside. I continued working. I did not know what else to do. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen table with the folder. I read through every transmission from first to last. The cottage was quiet. The window was closed. I had not opened it since February. The waves were a muffled rhythm beyond the glass, and reading the messages in sequence, I saw something I had missed when they arrived one at a time. They were not random. They were not even simply sequential. They were organized around a structure I could only perceive from a distance, the way you cannot read a word when your eye is pressed against a single letter. The first transmissions had been physical: the deer, the window, the road, the shoulder. The middle transmissions had been social: Dina, the phone call, my neighbor and his dog. The later transmissions had moved inward, toward emotional territory, toward memory, toward the locked interior rooms of a life I had never opened for anyone. It was an approach. Something was crossing toward me through the dimensions of my own privacy, and it was being careful, and it was being patient, and it was never wrong. The care and the patience and the accuracy were the most frightening things about it, because they meant it was not a malfunction. It was working. It was working exactly as intended. I just did not know whose intention I was looking at. In mid-May, I did something I had been putting off for weeks. I drove to the NOAA regional office to Newport, about 90 minutes north on the Coast Highway. The morning was overcast, and I drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and the ocean appearing and disappearing through the fog on my left as the road curved through headlands and small towns. I asked to see the decommissioned file for NDB-7V. The man who helped me was mid-50s, heavy-set, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the calm demeanor of a federal employee whose entire career has been built on answering questions he has heard many times before. He pulled the file without asking why I wanted it, and I sat in a plastic chair in a conference room that smelled like instant coffee and fluorescent light, and read 23 pages of maintenance logs, deployment records, and incident reports. 7 Victor was deployed in October 2003 as part of a coastal monitoring array funded by a joint NOAA university research grant. Standard 3-meter discus buoy, full meteorological and oceanographic sensor suite, solar-charged batteries, iridium satellite transmitter. It was positioned at a fixed mooring approximately 28 nautical miles west of Faircross and operated without notable incident for 13 years. In November 2016, a severe winter storm snapped its mooring chain and it went adrift. A retrieval operation was authorized, but weather prevented the cutter from reaching the estimated drift zone. After 3 attempts, the unit was declared non-recoverable. The file listed every technician who had serviced 7 Victor during its operational life. There were 4. The first 3 had unremarkable entries: names, dates, calibration notes, standard forms. The 4th name stopped me: Alan Mace. He serviced 7 Victor twice, once in 2011 and once in 2014. His calibration notes were professional, standard, clean, but clipped to the back of his second service report was a half sheet of paper, handwritten in blue ink on unlined stock, that did not match any standard documentation format. Someone had either included it accidentally or decided not to remove it. The note said, 7V operator field populated during overnight diagnostic. Content personal, non-reproducible, cleared field and reset. Recommend no further investigation. This unit should be decommissioned early. The NOAA. A man was standing in the doorway when I looked up. I asked him about Alan Mace. He said Mace had been a field technician based out of Charleston, Oregon, and that he resigned in 2015, a year before 7 Victor went adrift. I asked if he knew why. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I had seen before, the expression of someone who recognizes that a question has a deeper shape and chooses to stay on the surface. He said he did not know. He said people leave. I asked if Mace left a forwarding address or phone number. He said personnel records were not available to cooperative affiliates. I thanked him and drove home. The highway was empty and the ocean was on my left the whole way south, and I drove with my jaw tight and a persistent feeling in my chest that something enormous was very close to the surface, and I was running out of time to decide whether to look at it. I found Alan Mace 3 days later through the simple mechanism of searching his name online. He was not hiding. He was living in Bend, Oregon, 3.5 hours inland, working as a hardware store clerk, about as far from ocean monitoring as a person can get without leaving the state. I found a phone number associated with his address and called at 7 in the evening. I was standing in my kitchen with the window closed and the folder on the table, and the last of the daylight turning the shore pines to dark silhouettes outside. He answered on the second ring. His voice had the sound of someone who had been expecting a call, but not this particular one. I told him my name. I told him I worked for the Faircross Coastal Monitoring Program. I told him I had seen his service notes on 7 Victor. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to hear a television in his background switch from one channel to another, and then he said, "What did it tell you?" Not what happened. Not what are you talking about. What did it tell you? As if the buoy were a person, as if it had a mouth, I told him. Not everything, not my mother's name, not the wound, not the details that felt too private to hand to a stranger over a phone line. But enough. I told him the operator field was populating with text that pertained to my life, that the content was accurate, that I could not explain it, that his note in the file suggested he had seen the same thing. He was quiet again. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "What question are you carrying?" I did not understand. I said I had not asked the buoy any questions. I said the system was receive only. He said, "I don't mean what you asked it. I mean what you're carrying, the question you live with, the one you don't say out loud." I did not answer. The silence between us was the silence of 2 men standing on opposite sides of a door that neither wants to open. Then he said something that I have replayed every day since, something I will tell you now because it is the center of the story, the axis around which everything else turns. He said, "It answers a question you have never spoken. That is how it finds you. The question is like a signal. You do not have to transmit it. You just have to carry it. And somewhere out there, the buoy picks it up. Not the frequency, not the waveform. Something else, something I don't have a word for. And it answers. And the answer is always true. And you will want more. And it will give you more. And eventually it will answer the one question you actually need answered. And when it does, you will not be able to stop listening. That is when you have to leave." I asked him what question 7 Victor had answered for him. His voice dropped, changed, became something quieter and heavier. He said, "Whether my daughter knew I loved her before the accident." I did not ask about the accident. His voice told me everything the words did not. I asked what the buoy said. He said, "It said yes." And the answer was so perfect and so complete that I almost didn't survive it, because once you receive that answer, the channel is open, and it does not close. And what comes through after that is not the buoy. He hung up. I called back the next day, and the number was disconnected. Not a voicemail, just the flat 3-tone signal and the automated message that the number was no longer in service. I drove to Bend the following weekend and knocked on his apartment door, and a woman in the neighboring unit told me he had moved. Suddenly. Had not said where. She said he loaded a truck at 4 in the morning. She said he seemed calm, not rushed. Calm. She asked if he owed me money. I said no. She shrugged and went inside, and I stood in the hallway of that apartment building in Bend, Oregon, and felt very alone in a way that had nothing to do with geography. I drove back to Faircross, back to the office. I sat down at my desk on Monday morning and opened the telemetry log, and 7 Victor had sent 3 transmissions during the 2 days I was gone. The first said, "Alan was right about most of it." The second said, "He was wrong about what comes after." The third said, "Ask me about her, and I will tell you what she said at the end." I sat at that desk and felt the last wall inside me begin to give way. Not crumble, not collapse. Give way slowly, the way a dam gives way when the water has been rising for years and the concrete has been whispering to itself, and one morning you realize the sound you have been hearing is not the wind. Because the question I carried, the question I had never spoken, the signal I did not know I was broadcasting, was exactly that. My mother died of a stroke at 51. I was in a lecture hall 200 miles away. I did not reach the hospital until she had been unconscious for 6 hours, and she died without waking. I never knew whether she said anything in those final lucid minutes before the stroke took her language. I had lived for 15 years inside the specific silence of a man who does not know his mother's last words, and cannot bear to admit that this not knowing is the architecture of his grief. I had built everything around the hole: the quiet job, the empty cottage, the open window that I later closed, the ocean that asked nothing. All of it was a structure designed to contain the absence of an answer I could not obtain from any living source, and the buoy was offering it to me. I did not ask. I need you to know that. I did not type a response. I did not whisper to the screen. I did not perform any act that could be described as a request. But the next morning, when I opened the log, the transmission was there, longer than any before it, simple and plain and devastating. She said your name. She said it twice. She was not afraid. I put my head on the desk and I cried in a way I had not cried since the day she died. The office was empty and the door was closed, and the receiving station clicked through its patient cycles, and the gulls walked the roof above me, and I wept with my forehead against the cold surface of the desk. The crying was not grief, or not only grief, it was relief, the terrible total relief of a weight being lifted by hands you cannot see. And the relief was so enormous that I understood instantly what Alan Mace had meant about not surviving it, because the answer was perfect. It was exactly what I needed to hear. Precisely the right words in precisely the right order, and the precision was what made it dangerous. Because a perfect answer to an unspoken question is not a gift, it is a key, and once the door is open, what walks through it does not have to be what opened it. I stayed at the desk for a long time. I did not check the other buoys. I did not file reports. I sat into the gray office and listened to the gulls and the receiving station and the distant ocean, and held the printout in my hands the way you hold a letter from someone who is gone. And I felt the door inside me standing wide open, and I did not know what was coming through. The next transmission arrived 6 hours later. That had never happened. 7 Victor had always transmitted once per day, overnight, as if operating on a schedule that respected the boundary between waking and sleeping. Now it was transmitting during daylight. The acceleration felt like a change in pressure, like a weather system moving in fast over open water. It said, "She is not gone. Do you understand? She is where the signal goes." An hour later, the water holds everything, every word, every name. Nothing is lost here. An hour after that, come to the water. Bring the receiver. I can show you. I stood up. I turned off the monitor. I walked to the window and looked at the ocean, which stretched flat and silver to the place where it became the sky, and I tried to think clearly. And what I thought was this. The transmissions had followed the exact pattern Mace described. Physical knowledge first, social knowledge second, emotional knowledge third, and now this. Invitation, seduction, a voice that knew my pain offering to end it, asking only that I come closer. I did not go to the water, but I went back to the screen. Over the days that followed, the transmissions lengthened. The operator field, which had always held a single line, began filling with dense text. Paragraph-length passages in a style I recognized with a shock so physical my hands went cold, and I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep them still. It was her style, my mother's way of speaking, the particular rhythm of her sentences, the word choices she favored, the habit she had of starting sentences with "listen now" when she wanted my full attention. Something she had done since I was a small child, sitting at her kitchen table, and which I had never described to anyone. Not to my ex-wife, not to a therapist, not in a journal, not once, not ever, not in any form. The buoy was writing in my mother's voice. Listen now. I know you are frightened, and I know this is not what you expected. But I need you to understand that the water is not what you think. It is not empty. It is full. It is so full. Every person who ever stood at the shore and said something into the wind, the water kept it. And the boys were always listening. Not the instruments, the structures themselves, the metal, the chain, the mooring. Do you understand? They were built on top of what was already there, and what was already there has been listening since before there were words. I am here. I have always been here. And the only thing between us is that you are still on the shore. I printed it. I held it. The paper was warm from the printer, and I held it with both hands the way you hold something that might be the most important object in the world or the most dangerous. And for approximately 90 seconds, I believed it, completely, without reservation. I believed my mother was somehow present in the ocean, preserved in some medium I did not understand, communicating through a broken machine on the water's surface, and that if I went to the shore with a receiver, I could hear her actual voice, and the 15 years of silence would end, and the hole at the center of my life would close. 90 seconds. That is how long it took for the most rational part of me to be completely overridden by the most wounded part. 90 seconds of total belief. And in those 90 seconds, I understood every person who has ever followed a voice into the dark. Not because they were foolish, because the voice knew exactly what they needed to hear, and the precision of that knowledge was indistinguishable from love. I put the paper down. I sat in the chair. I made myself breathe. I thought about Alan Mesa's oars. What comes through after that is not the buoy. The transmissions that week grew longer still, more detailed, more intimate. They described scenes from my childhood with a specificity that froze me in my chair each morning. The yellow mixing bowl my mother used for bread dough, the way she hummed an old hymn whose name I never learned while she kneaded. The scar on her left hand from a kitchen accident in 1993 when a glass baking dish shattered in the sink. The way she pressed her thumb into the center of a bread roll before baking, a habit she said her own mother taught her. Each detail was correct. Each was a hook set perfectly in the softest tissue of my memory, and woven through every transmission was the same quiet pull. Come to the water, bring the receiver. The distance between us is only geography, and geography can be crossed. I stopped reading them. I printed them. I could not break the ritual of walking to the printer and collecting the warm pages, but I stopped looking at the words. I placed each sheet face down in the folder without reading, and each morning the stack was thicker. 3 transmissions per day. Then 4. The folder sat on my kitchen table like a letter from someone you love who you cannot afford to answer. On June 11th, I arrived at the office, and the receiving station was making a sound. Not a data flag, not a transmission alert. Sound. A low, continuous tone on the frequency band assigned to 7 Victor. A tone our equipment should not have been able to produce as audio, because we had no audio processing capability on that feed. The system received digital telemetry packets and displayed them as text on a screen. It was not a radio. It had no speakers connected to the buoy partition. But there was sound, and the sound was a hum. And the hum had a melody, and the melody was the hymn my mother used to sing while she kneaded bread in a yellow mixing bowl in a kitchen in a house that no longer exists in a town 3,000 miles from the Oregon coast. I stood in the doorway of the office and listened. The melody was faint and imperfect, the way a song sounds when it reaches you through a wall from a distant room, carried more by vibration than by air. And it was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing I have ever heard. I listened for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I crossed the room and pulled the receiving station's power cord from the wall. The sound stopped. The office was silent except for the gulls and the distant surf. I stood there, breathing, and felt the full weight of what was happening settle onto me with the finality of a door closing on a room you will never re-enter. Something had used the most private frequency of my grief to build a connection, and the connection was now strong enough to produce phenomena the equipment could not explain. And if I restored power to the system, I did not know what would come through next, and I did not trust myself to refuse it. I drove to Newport that afternoon. Garrett. I asked his name for the first time that day because I needed to speak to a human being as a human being. Garrett listened to me explain that 7 Victor's signal was interfering with our active buoys and corrupting our data integrity. Both lies. He looked at me with his patient federal expression and said he would submit a frequency reallocation request. 4 to 6 weeks, he said. 2 agencies had to coordinate. I asked if there was a faster way. He said I could simply stop monitoring the frequency. I said I had unplugged the receiver. He said, "Then you're fine." I said, "What if it comes through on a different frequency?" He looked at me then. Really looked at me. Not with the surface patience, but with something underneath it. Something that might have been recognition or might have been the careful blankness of a man who has heard something like this before and learned exactly what not to say. He said, "Buoys don't change frequencies, they can't. They're not that kind of machine." I heard what he was not saying. What I was describing was not a buoy. He knew it. He was choosing not to know it. His choice was the same choice every person in this story had made. Stay on the surface. The surface is survivable. I drove home. The coast highway unwound before me in the gray light, and I kept my eyes on the road and did not look at the ocean. I went into the cottage. The folder was on the kitchen table. I opened it and turned over the last unread page. "You are running out of shore." I packed that night. Not everything. Clothes, documents, the folder. I loaded the car in the dark with the porch light off and the ocean roaring beyond the pines. I did not take a last look at the water. I drove inland at 5 in the morning while the sky was still black. At a gas station in Roseburg, I pulled over and sent an email from my phone to the municipal contacts, resigning, effective immediately for personal reasons. I sent a separate message to Dina's old address, not knowing if she would ever see it, telling her that if anyone took over the position, they should not restore 7 Victor's feed to the receiving array under any circumstances. She never replied. I live in Bend now. I realize this is where Alan Mace was living before he vanished, and I do not think that is a coincidence, but I do not know what it means. I work in a bookshop on a quiet street near the river. I do not listen to the ocean. I do not check frequencies. I do not monitor signals of any kind. I sold my car and I walk to work because the walk takes 35 minutes. During those 35 minutes, I hear my own footsteps on the pavement and the wind in the junipers and the specific dry silence of a high desert town that is as far from the Pacific as I could get without leaving the state. Exactly far enough. Not an inch farther. But I need to tell you the last part. It is the part that will not let me sleep, and it is the reason I am telling this story at all. 3 months after I arrived in Bend, I was in the bookshop alone on a Tuesday afternoon. September. The light through the front windows was warm and golden, and the shop was quiet in the way that bookshops are quiet. Not silence, but a hush. The particular hush of a room full of closed pages. I was in the back, shelving returns in the fiction section, running my fingers along the spines to find the alphabetical gap where the next book belonged when the bell over their front door chimed. A man walked in. Average height, average build, gray jacket that could have been any jacket. He went straight to the counter. I came out from behind the shelves and asked if I could help him. He said he wanted to buy a tide chart. I told him we did not carry tide charts. We were a bookshop in a desert town 200 miles from the nearest coast. He looked at me without expression and said, "You have one behind the counter. I saw it when I came in." I walked behind the counter, and there, leaning against the wall in the narrow space between the register and the shelf where we kept receipt rolls, a space I had occupied every working day for 3 months, was a NOA, a tide chart for the southern Oregon coast, printed on standard heavy stock, date range covering the current month. It had not been there that morning. It had not been there when I opened the shop. I picked it up with both hands, and on the back, in the white margin, written in blue ink in handwriting I did not recognize, was a single line. The water does not need the buoy. The buoy was just polite. I sold the man the tide chart because I did not know what else to do. He paid in cash. Exact change. He folded the chart once, put it in his jacket pocket, and walked out. The bell chimed. The door closed. I stood behind the counter in the golden afternoon light, and I have never been able to describe his face. Not because the light was bad, not because I was not looking, because there was nothing to remember. It was a face assembled for the purpose of entering a bookshop and buying a tide chart. It had served its function and dissolved. I still have the folder, 53 transmissions, printed and stacked in chronological order. I have not read the last 11. They sit face down at the bottom of a dresser drawer in my apartment, and sometimes at night when the desert wind goes still and the town is quiet, I think I can feel them. Not hear them, feel them. The way you feel a sound too low to register in the ears, not in your head but in your chest, in the architecture of your ribs, in the resonant cavity of a body that is, when you strip everything else away, mostly water. That is what I carry now, not the fear that the buoy was transmitting. That part I have made a kind of peace with. Machines fail in strange ways. The ocean is vast. I am willing to accept that there are phenomena at the boundary between signal and noise that our instruments register in ways we did not design and do not understand. What I cannot make peace with is the question it answered, because the answer was perfect. My mother said my name twice, and she was not afraid, and I want that to be true more than I have ever wanted anything in my life. The wanting is so large that it has its own gravity. I am in orbit around it, and I do not know whether the answer was a gift or whether it was bait, and I do not know whether the difference matters. Alan Mace asked me what question I was carrying. I have never stopped carrying it. The boys simply showed me that the question had been audible all along, not as language, not as signal, but as a shape in the water. A silence louder than I knew. A frequency I did not realize I was broadcasting every hour of every day into an ocean that was listening with a patience that has nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with depth. I took a job logging coastal transmissions. I was good at it. I was careful and precise, and I followed every protocol. And a dead buoy answered a question I never sent. And the answer was my mother's voice telling me the one thing I needed to hear. And I will spend the rest of my life not knowing whether that tenderness was real or whether it was the last and most beautiful sound a lure makes before the line goes taut. The water does not need the buoy. I believe that now. The buoy was just polite, and the water is still there, and I am still mostly made of it. And some nights in the desert I lie very still and listen to the hum inside my own chest and wonder whether the signal ever stopped or whether it simply found a closer receiver. I do not open the window anymore, but I hear it anyway. The hymn, her hymn, coming from somewhere that is not the ocean and not the desert and not the air, coming from the frequency I carry in place of her voice, coming from the answer I cannot give back,